So today, we'll keep this going with our first feature address of Day 2 by Professor Ayşe Zarakol. This address will focus on understanding how we can navigate a highly volatile international relations landscape and the opportunities this will bring if one were to embrace the challenges this landscape conceals. With that, to introduce our speaker, please welcome Halil Ucarer, Head of Europe at Khazanah National.
Good morning, dear guests, friends, and colleagues. It's my honor and great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Ayşe Zarakol. Mrs. Zarakol is a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Emmanuel College. Her research primarily explores the historical and theoretical foundations of global orders, East-West relations in the international system, the politics of rising and declining powers, as well as international relations theory. She has published widely in leading academic journals, such as the American Political Science Review and the European Journal of International Relations. Her contributions have been widely recognized. She is a fellow of the British Academy and in 2023 received the prestigious Koç Medal of Science, awarded to scholars of Turkish origin for outstanding global success in their field. Professor Zarakol is also the author of several influential works, most recently, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, which has won multiple prestigious awards. Published in 2022, the book offers us a history of international relations that does not start in the West, but here, in Asia, and urges us to rethink key concepts such as order, sovereignty, and decline. As she reminds us in her work, broadening our temporal and geographical horizon helps us think about how world orders come about and how they are replaced. Today, we are living in an era of shifting power balances, multipolar competition, crisis of global governance, and renewed tensions between East and West. And I believe Professor Zarakol's perspectives could not be more valuable than they are today. This makes her an ideal speaker for our conference, where we focus on uncertainty, and as such, we shall reflect on how past orders may influence the power balances of today. We are very fortunate to have her with us today, so please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Ayşe Zarakol.
Hello. We live in interesting times. Our century has been very eventful since the beginning. We opened this century with the 9/11 attacks on the United States, which was followed by America's global war on terror, conducted on multiple stages. That was followed by what was called the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, felt especially acutely in Western capitals. That was followed by, again, the so-called Arab Spring, which introduced a decade of volatility to the Middle East and North Africa. We witnessed the rise of new forms of global terror, the Islamic State with regional outreach. And that was followed by a magnified refugee crisis reaching the shores of, again, Europe and also many global settings. That increased the popularity of right-wing populist movements, especially in the West. And in 2016, we started seeing the political effects of these movements. We had Brexit in the UK. We have the election of, the first term election of President Trump in the United States. And we started witnessing growing tensions between the two great powers of our time, United States and America. And that was followed by the global COVID pandemic, which the whole world felt. And just as that was coming to a close, we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is still ongoing and having multiple repercussions, especially in Europe. And that was followed by the October 7 attacks and Israel's brutal retaliation on Gaza, driving a further wedge between the West and the global South. And now we have the second Trump term. Trump is back in power in the United States and is pushing all sorts of policies, including tariffs, that are creating more volatility around the globe. So there is, at least in my discipline, which is international relations, there's growing concern about what this all means. How do we explain one event after another? How do we make sense of this? Everybody is asking what is going on in the 21st century that is causing all of this. And the answer seems to be, at least in the workshops and conferences that I attend, the answer seems to be that the 21st century is one of disorder. What we're experiencing is the breakdown of the 20th century international order. This is at least how it's felt, how it's being experienced in the West. And in order to make sense of this disorder, in order to figure out how we're going to get out of it, Western policymakers and academics look to history, and they come up with two possible answers as to, what's going on. Can we learn from history in order to make sense of the disorder of the 21st century? And those two answers are, there's a group of scholars who argue that what we're going through is unprecedented. There's never been a period like this one in history. The 21st century is unprecedented in terms of how much disorder there is. And then there's a second camp that sees parallels between the 21st century and the 20th century. If I can provide you with the arguments for these two camps briefly, the unprecedented camp, and you will have heard this term perhaps in Financial Times or other outlets. The economic historian Adam Tooze sometimes talks about polycrisis. The argument goes something like, we've always had wars, but in the 21st century, in addition to wars and great power tensions, we also have climate change, we also have pandemics, we have technological challenges. All of this together makes the crises we face multifaceted, very complex, a polycrisis. There is no precedent for this in history. And the other camp, usually policymakers in the West, academics who study politics, international relations, they tend to see the 20th century as the only possible precedent, and what we see often in newspapers, magazines, are 20th century analogies. So there is a talk about the period we're in being similar to interwar years between World War I and World War II, and presumably the disorder will end with something like World War II, and then from that is going to emerge the next 21st century order, and there's, again, talk about a new Cold War, right? That was the 20th century setting. So this time, not between United States and the Soviet Union, but United States and China. So people are already talking about Cold War 2.0. And again, you'll see many references to this in newspapers, magazines, academic journals. What I want to suggest to you today is that both of these camps may be wrong. That our times are neither unprecedented nor are they like the 20th century. I think the 20th century analogy is tempting because it's what we know. It's recent history, people remember it, so it's tempting to go there. It's especially tempting for the West, because 20th century in general was a Western century, right? Even after the brutal devastation of the two world wars, the order that was created was a Western-centric order. So there is, I think, a familiarity, a comfort, an appeal in the 20th century analogy. But there are four, I think, major ways the 21st century is quite different from the 20th century, and that's why the 20th century analogy is wrong. First, and these are global trends, there is a global erosion of trust in institutions, especially institutions of the state. As we entered the 20th century, both left-wing and right-wing projects tended to believe that the state, the nation-state, could provide solutions to problems of society. Very few people believe this in the 21st century. I mean, there are many surveys that prove this. Here's just one. But again, we can look at many examples. In general, globally, people look to solutions other than government institutions, state institutions, to help solve their problems, or they think nothing will solve their problems. But there isn't that same belief in many places, not everywhere, of course, but globally there isn't that same belief in the state and the nation state. That's one big difference between the 20th and the 21st centuries. The second global trend that we are experiencing is what is called the global rise of strongmen. We are witnessing this in all types of regimes. Strongmen, that we can give many examples. Strongmen are something different than just autocrats. Strongmen tend to personalize whatever regime that they find themselves in. They centralize power. It's more about foreign policy, becomes more about personal preferences and opinions. They tend not to be particularly ideological. And again, this is a global trend. We're seeing it in the West. We're seeing it in the East, in the global North, global South, parliamentary democracies, presidential democracies, one-party regimes. They are all producing their version of strongman. And that is something very different from the 20th century competition of more ideological, more state-oriented regimes. The third way the 21st century is different from the 20th century is there are simply many more players, many more actors in the game of international politics. We often talk about the differences between East and West, global North, global South, but one way the 21st century is very different from the 20th century is that what is called the rise of the global South. 20th century tended to be dominated by great power politics, and there's a temptation, there's a thinking that 21st century will similarly be dominated by great power politics, but I don't think that's going to be the case because countries, institutions, businesses in the global south have much more capability now compared to the 20th century, and they have much more confidence. They want to have a say in politics, as you know, as we're seeing also here, and that changes the equation of international politics quite a bit when you have many more players in the game making decisions. And finally, the fourth major way the 21st century is different is the structural changes, the issues beyond politics are accelerating. So climate change is one major structural change, and this is only going to gain speed as we go further into the 21st century, and we do not know exactly what the impact of climate change is going to be on supply chains, trade, our ability to travel, on capitalism, right? There are many repercussions down the line that we cannot fully foresee. And the same thing with technology. I mean, we often talk about nowadays about AI, about robotics. We mentioned these things in our conferences. We talk about innovation. But the speed with which these technological advances are reshaping our societies, again, I think it makes 21st century quite unpredictable and unlike the 20th century. The reconfiguration of the workforce, of educational institutions, of politics, again, we cannot fully foresee what our world is going to look like a few decades from now. So all of that at least persuades me that the 20th century analogies are, as comforting as they may be, I think they are misplaced. At the same time, I do think, even for an age of uncertainty, there are precedents in history. And for that, we need to look beyond European history. Because we tend to, again, in my field, in international relations, we tend to focus only on European Western history from 17th century onwards. And if you only look at that, you might conclude there are no precedents for what is going on. But if you broaden your horizons and look at world history beyond Europe, beyond the West, I think there are precedents. And for a precedent, I'm going to suggest to you the 17th century, which is already invoked in the concept paper for this conference. And I'll try to make the case for, if we're looking for an analogy, if we're looking for a period to get lessons from, I think the 17th century may be more apt. And that argument comes out of my book, Before the West, which has already been referred to. And what I try to do in Before the West is to write a history of international relations that is not centered in Europe or the West, a history that started in Asia. And in order to do that, my book starts in the 13th century with the empire of the Mongols. And the reason I start there is this is a unifying moment for much of Asia, where they come under the same political forces, people who live in this continent. Even in places like Malaysia, where the Mongols did not directly invade, they changed the fate of politics. You know, by their invasion of, Java, they changed the political landscape. So the impact of the Mongols was felt across Asia, across much of Eurasia. And what I argue in the book is that a world order was created in the 13th century with legacies that last decades and centuries to come. And I look at, in the book, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. And the 16th century world order that I discuss in the book was dominated by Western Asian Muslim empires that also carried influences of the Mongols. They controlled much of the world's economy. This was a period of great global connectivity, increased trade, a population boom. It's a rich, connected century. But what's important for my purposes here for this talk is it all kind of comes to a halt in the 17th century. The 17th century has been long recognized by historians as a period of general crisis. People talked about the general crisis in Europe, but now we know that there was a general crisis across much of the northern hemisphere at least. You have all types of political turmoil across Eurasia. You have the 30 Years' War in Europe. You have rebellions in the Ottoman Empire. Of course, in China, the Ming they lose power. There's the time of troubles in Russia. There seems to be decades and decades of political turmoil, disruption of overland trade routes. It's a very, very messy century. So if we are trying to capture what made the 17th century very messy, so I've mentioned rebellions and wars all across, and the further north you go, the more of them. It's also a period where there's the spread of absolutist rulers, rulers who centralize and again personalize power. This trend reaches Europe at this point. There is surprisingly climate change in the 17th century. We tend to think climate change is a recent problem, and of course man-made climate change arguably is a post-industrial revolution problem, but the 17th century was also experiencing climate change. It was the high point of a longer period called the Little Ice Age. And temperatures in the northern hemisphere were 2 to 3 Celsius cooler. There were all sorts of unpredictable weather patterns which had impact on agriculture. There were crop failures, and historians now think some of the wars and rebellions had to do with this resource scarcity issues and also the disruption of overland trade. And of course, it's also the century that we associate with the European scientific revolution, which allowed, European enlightenment, many new innovations, the new ways of thinking and looking at the world, started gaining steam in this century. And finally, it was a period of demographic decline. After the population boom of the 16th century and the connectivity and the trade of the 16th century, in the 17th century we have demographic decline. Many villages disappear off tax registers across Eurasia. Some of that is due to, of course, wars and rebellions, and probably having to do with, again, agricultural challenges and resource scarcity. So, having characterized the 17th century in this manner, the similarities become self-evident, right? In the 21st century, there was a belief in international relations that we left interstate war behind, but in the 20th century, these wars seem to be coming back. Whether this trend will continue remains to be seen, but we are seeing a trend in this manner. Are strongmen, global trend of strongmen, potentially comparable to the absolutist rulers of this age of absolutism in early modernity? We have, again, climate change, this time, of course, getting warmer, not colder. And the technological advances that we are experiencing with AI and robotics have the potential, arguably, to fundamentally alter society and the way we think about the world as scientific revolution did in the 17th century. And again, maybe it's too early to say, but we do seem to be in a period of demographic decline. Birth rates are falling everywhere across all regions of the world except, I think, Africa at this point, although they also have slowed down. So if we're looking for historical analogies, I think the 17th century is a much better candidate than the 20th century for this global moment. And, analogies, history will never exactly repeat itself, but analogies are helpful to think with in terms of helping us imagine potential scenarios. We look at history not to find out exactly what will happen, but to spark our imagination about potential outcomes. So if we look at the 17th century, what are some of the lessons? One is that long periods of disorder are a possibility, because historically there have been long periods of disorder. The 17th century general crisis, as it is called, or the period of disorder, lasts from the end of the 16th century to the last quarter of the 17th century. Almost a century of political tumultuousness was the experience of most people who lived across Eurasia in the northern hemisphere. So we need to get out of this mindset, which I think the 20th century analogy leads us to. Oh, it will be a few years of volatility, but then order will reassert itself as it did in the 20th century. That's one possibility, but it's also possible that there will be many, many decades of uncertainty. The second, I think, lesson from the 17th century is that there doesn't need to be one international order. Fragmentation and regionalization is also a possibility. This is what happened in the 17th century. Because we don't know the history of the 16th century very well, we tend to think, the world has been fragmented and regionalized forever, and only European arrival connected different regions of the world to each other. But if you believe me, and I make the case in the book, Asia was very connected in the 16th century, much more connected than it was in the 17th century. It's the 17th century that fragmented Asia, Eurasia. So we need to be prepared for this possibility that the 21st century is going to be one of fragmentation and regionalization rather than one of convergence and universalization. And finally, the main thing that happens in the 17th century is the shift in the center of gravity. Before the 17th century, the world is dominated by Asian actors. And after the 17th century, in the 18th, 19th century, it's dominated by European actors who are kind of building on they were able to take over the fragments of the previous international or the previous world order, and of course, there are European colonial outposts in Asia before the 18th century, but European colonialism really undergoes a fundamental shift from after the 17th century. So there was this shift in the center of gravity from east to west after this long period of disorder. And again, if disorder of the 21st century lasts a long time, there may be similar center of gravity shifts. Okay, I will leave you with one thought. I suppose this is the subject of a much longer conversation. But why was it that it was Europe and European actors that emerged from this period of disorder in the 17th century with an advantage? And what can we learn from that history? I think there are two lessons that we can learn from European historical success that is applicable to Malaysia and also other similarly situated countries. One is that because prior to the 17th century, Europe as a region was more war-prone and more economically backward, more provincial, they had actually developed a higher tolerance for uncertainty, risk, and disorder going into the 17th century. They had certain institutions that could deal with risk, like, you know, why was the notion of insurance invented in Europe rather than Asia? Asia is politically much more stable compared to Europe prior to the 17th century. Because they were dealing with risk, they came up with the idea of insurance. And we can multiply those examples. So the prior disadvantage was an advantage in the period of disorder. And also the mindset, right? If we compare, you know, the 17th century troubles of England versus, you know, the Ottoman Empire or Ming China, in Asia, there's a desire to go back to recapture lost glory, because in recent memory they had great success. Europe was not in the same way backward looking in the 17th century. They were more open to innovation and new solutions, again, because of comparative disadvantage previously. I think these lessons apply now. I think countries like Malaysia, countries across the global south are in some ways much better primed to deal with a century of disorder than Western countries are, especially European countries are, who are much more used to stability and predictability and an international order that centers their preferences. And I think that advantage could really help countries like Malaysia thrive in the new world we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Wow, there's so much to think about. Thank you, Professor, for this very interesting talk. Now we'll open up the floor for questions. If you have questions, please. There's one question here. Please kindly first introduce yourself to the audience.
Hello, my name is Johan Abdul Razak, ex-Khazanah. My question for Professor Ayşe. May I ask you, what do you think of the notion that a potential solution for Europe to get out of its current political and economic quagmire is by discarding NATO and Uncle Sam and embrace Russia as a fellow European rather than the bogeyman? Thank you.
Okay. So it's an interesting question, and I think fellow IR theorists would like to play with this question. You know, if this was a game of risk, like a board game, rather than the real world, this is a possibility, right? This is, you ally with Russia, and then you have leverage. But I think this is just not possible. You know, I mean, I live in Europe. I spend my time speaking to European policymakers and academics, and I just cannot see any scenario under which they align with Russia, or, you know, actually, you know, those signs are there that they should take a much more defensive posture vis-a-vis the United States, but I just don't see it happening. I mean, they're so, especially the policy elites are so conditioned to work with the United States, they cannot imagine any other scenario.
Number one, please.
My name is Anthony Lau. I'm with time.com. Professor Ours, I appreciate your insights and perspective on 3 mega trends that I'd like to share with you, or you have observed. We are living in an epochal change for the first time in the history of mankind, the demographic is inverted. There are more 65 years old baby boomers like me than 5 years old around. And then if you look at Malaysia, by 2030, 1 in 5 will be more than 65 years old. And then when you look at the world's population, half are actually in ASEAN, China and India, 4 billion, and the rest of the world is 4 billion, so that makes 8 billion. And the third mega trend we are seeing is the center of economic gravity is shifting rapidly. The top 10 economic powers, if you look at it, 6 are actually in Asia, China, Global South, which means that if you look at the map of the economic center of gravity, the year 1000, I'm not talking about 17th century, I'm talking about the year 1000 is exactly what is going to happen by 2030. The map is identical.
Yeah.
So I would like to invite your key insights and your perspective on these 3 mega trends. Thank you very much.
Yes. I mean, you've already identified the historical norm. I mean, the third trend you mentioned. If we look at history, the norm is for the center of gravity economically and politically to be in Asia. So the last 2 centuries are the exception. So we could say that's just the historical norm and we're going back to that. But of course we need to also factor in, what's different in the 21st century is what we talk about the global south and the incorporation of, southern regions. So we're not just talking about Eurasia. So what kind of a role will they play in the future economically, I think remains to be seen. That's an open question. In terms of demographic decline, yeah, I mean, so globally, I think you're correct. This is something new. But as I was saying, there are historical periods where we did experience demographic decline. Another, I mentioned the 17th century. Another is, the impact of Black Death in Europe. And there's a long-standing argument in historical sociology that because some of what made it possible for regular people to have a little bit more power, political power and rights and so on in Europe, and also eventual rise of capitalism and so on, is the demographic decline Europe experienced after Black Death. So there are very few peasants left around, and then they suddenly become more valuable to society because there are few of them. So one could argue that even though there are many reasons to worry about demographic decline, at the same time it may balance out this trend where the other trend we're seeing, which is I've talked about strongman, but growing inequality and growing centralization and consolidation of wealth and power. Maybe if those centers need people, and there are not that many of us, they might, I don't know, perhaps give us more rights, so it may balance out. But of course that's going to be tempered with, AI and robotics. So how fast that catches up, maybe you don't need people anymore. I think, again, we can sketch out scenarios. It's very hard to say it will go definitely one way or another. It may be a bad thing or a good thing. I think that's open-ended. But the center, the shift back to Asia, I think that is definitely happening.
We'll take a question from the left side. Number 3, please.
Thank you, Prof, for that absolutely magisterial romp through 400 years of history. It kind of shows that, the Western dominance is a historical aberration, and I'm glad you conclude that it's all going to come back to Asia. But coming more to where we are today, Prof, can I ask, what is going to happen in Palestine?
Oh, that's the million dollar question. I mean, I can only speculate. What to me the most interesting thing that Palestine symbolizes is something I already referred to in my talk. This growing gap between the West and the rest of the world, because after Biden came to after Trump we had Biden. And there was this attempt to kind of salvage or shore up what used to be called the liberal international order. And there was much talk, at least in Europe, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was terrible, but at the same time it brought everyone together, gave a common purpose. So that's not ancient history, that's only a few years ago. But now it's very difficult to imagine the liberal international order, even talk about the liberal international order per se. And that's not just because of, I think Trump. In general, there's been this breakdown of the priorities of, the global, what's called the global South, the global East. And I think, Palestine is, a symptom or like evidence number one that, the world is going fragmented rather than converging around common causes. And of course, international law is one of the sad casualties of that reality.
We'll take one final question. Number 4, please.
Hi. Thank you for sharing that unconventional comparison, Professor. My name is Mei Yi, and I'm from Bright Spots Energy. When you compare sort of 2 centuries, we know that history needs to be viewed in its context. That is to say that there is continuity from what happened before. So even though you have highlighted the similarities between 17th century and 21st century, it's also what comes before that matters. For example, never before in history have we had the world come together in multilateral organizations like the United Nations and have that sort of cooperation. But now we are trying to turn back on those types of progress. And you also compare that there are strongmen back then, there are autocrats, absolutist rulers back then, as there are now, the rise of these types of rulers. But of course, a huge difference is that in 17th century, no absolutist ruler have the ability to obliterate the world with the press of a nuclear button. So I'm interested to see how you kind of draw that line with context in continuity between those two. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, those are excellent points. I mean, that's why I'm saying history will never exactly repeat itself, because once you look beyond some of the parallels, there are all these nuances that create contingencies and so on. But I think, I mean, the story that I want to, so multilateral institutions, they are a relatively new invention. They are a product of the 20th century. And potentially the absolutists, well, our strongmen are potentially more powerful than the absolute rulers back in the day because of, in the meantime, we've invented these states that have greater capabilities in surveillance and also war making. So what happens when you personalize that? So I think those are reasons that suggests that there are reasons to be both more worried of what happens if the similarities are correct, more worried because potentially the wars that we are going to have in the 21st century could be more deadly, more volatile than the 17th century. We have higher capability. At the same time, the regular people have more agency, more institutions that they can use, and maybe temper those excesses. All I want to do is to invite the comparison, so that we don't. I don't mean to say what will happen is exactly like the 17th century. What I mean to say is, let's think about this comparison, for better or worse, and what does that suggest? As much as we think about, the 20th century comparison or other comparisons, let's think with history and imagine potential scenarios. Not because history gives us one answer, but it gives us many possible answers to think with.
We're almost out of our time. Thank you, Professor Zarakol, for this incredible talk and sharing your views with us. I'm sure we'll go away asking too many questions to ourselves. And if you haven't read Professor's book, I highly recommend it. Thank you very much again for coming.